So, to begin my lesson this morning, I want to repeat the affirmation we began service with because it really kind of is the gist of the whole lesson today. Boredom is when my highest self is nudging me toward greater fulfillment of the purpose of my life. So, as most of you know, or maybe read in the newsletter, I just returned from this weekend at my mother's house. Now, it might amuse you that my lesson is about boredom, but I was anything but bored over these past particular 5 days with her. And she'd specifically asked me to come visit her so I could help her sort through some of her belongings as she continues to kind of downsize and simplify her life now that she's 85. And it was wonderful to have this deepening and sentimental experience of loving her in that way. And since it's this Father's Day, and since my dad died when I was so very young, my mom really served in both of those roles in my adult life. So I pause for just a moment to honor her for that. But even though my dad died so young, he died when he was 46 and I was 19, so very, very young. One of my earliest lessons I remember from my dad is that my boredom was not my parents' responsibility. It was solely mine. And we were expected to manage our free time in a productive way. So if he could smell boredom on us, there were always chores to do. So basically I learned be busy or at least look busy, right? And I'm not sure the wisdom of that expectation of productivity, but in some ways how boredom was viewed in my family may have been pretty helpful. So I may have shared with you that one of my greatest blessings and biggest challenges of my childhood was that we were not allowed to have a television in our home. So my dad said it was against our religion, but I'm not exactly sure where that belief might have come from. But through childhood, I've heard of other kind of fundamentalist families, not having televisions as well. But looking back at my own family experience, I think that it was about my dad controlling beliefs and thoughts and making sure they weren't influenced too much by outside culture. And also looking back, I'm not sure that that was a horrible thing, but man, I hated it when I was younger. So think about it. Think back to your own life and imagine it without a television. So while those of you who are kind of around my age were watching The Brady Bunch and MASH and All in the Family, I was not. And I missed the big news events like Diana and Charles's wedding and the Watergate scandal and Bobby Riggs playing Billie Jean King, even Elvis dying, just to name a few of the things that happened during that part of my life. And of course, I heard about those things at school and stuff, but I was not personally getting it from what my grandfather called the boob tube, okay? So I heard about my friends like rushing home from school to finish their chores and homework so they could watch Gilligan's Island or Charlie's Angels or whatever, but maybe you did that too, but there was no reason for me to rush. So while most kids were doing all of that, I was left to explore my curiosity about life and interesting concepts through books and magazines and actually active in the world. In those formative years, I was learning musical instruments and being a Girl Scout and building friendships and focusing on my academics and volunteering and accepting and exploring a vast amount of leadership opportunities and extracurricular activities. I was reading and more reading. And I do not exaggerate when I say that I used to read the encyclopedia sitting in the living room where the television should have been. We had this big rack of encyclopedias. And so I just was very, very curious. And I now realize that I did more living while many of my peers were watching other people live on their screens. So I didn't learn at an early age the habit of reaching for a screen or a remote of a gaming system to avoid boredom. With no TV as a child and no computer or internet until I was about 35, my personal relationship with downtime was fairly established. So I seldom find myself bored. Life around me has always been so interesting, and anything on a screen was far less so. So I often think about how my young life was influenced and how it influences how I live today. And who was it that taught me how to live? So while I was at my mom's house, one of the things we looked at were belongings that spoke to many of my early influences. So mom is a watercolorist and a writer and a reader, and her home reflects all of that. And while I was there, she and Dick, I think they turned the television on 2 times, and it was when I insisted that we watch a movie. So there was not a lot of reliance on television even in her life today. And if things got too quiet, she would say, "Come on, let's go for a walk." And we would go for a walk. Off we would go. And looking back even earlier in my influences, my mom had acquired some things from her mother's passing. And mom and I sorted through hundreds of Nana's photographs, but also tangible objects. And she mentioned many quilts and blankets that my grandmother had created. Mom and I talked about how Nana would occupy her free time by sewing and humming. And mom said, "I think she was meditating when she did that." Now that word got my attention. My grandmother meditating? I never thought about, and I would never say that my grandmother meditated, but she sat there and sewed and hummed and thought and thought. She wasn't bored because she was sewing and she was thinking. The bottom line is that neither my grandmother nor my mother looked outside themselves for stimulation and relief from boredom, especially not from screens, because what my grandma had, what a little tiny black and white television, when she had it, and she didn't really watch it that much. And intergenerationally, our minds are active and engaged with the real world happening around us. We deal with boredom in interesting ways, I think. So let's talk about boredom and see if we can see the opportunity it presents spiritually to us, each and every one of us, actually. So just for clarity, the National Institutes of Health defines boredom as boredom is the emotional and psychological state of feeling weary, restless, and dissatisfied due to a lack of interest, stimulation, or challenge. It occurs when you have the energy and desire to engage in an activity but are unable to find or participate in anything satisfying. By that definition, boredom does not sound very pleasant. Weary, restless, and dissatisfied. When we want to engage in something meaningful but we can't find anything, it sounds painful. And since it is our nature as human beings to avoid pain and discomfort, we try to relieve our boredom as expeditiously as we possibly can. It's not the kind of pain that Tylenol can handle, right? So what do we do? The vast majority of us in our culture right here and now, what do we do when we're bored? Pick up our screens. We start scrambling for a screen. Matter of fact, most of us don't even give ourselves a second to get bored. And we reach for our screens at the first moment of idle time we face. Please tell me I'm not alone, right? Right? So most of us come to spirituality to give us new ways to address our human pain and discomfort, don't we? We come here seeking new answers to old problems, and many seek spirituality to break addictive behaviors that numb us. So I think we're often numbing the feeling, that painful feeling of boredom, to keep us from accepting the message that it has for us, the feedback our very life is giving us. So spirituality gives us new perspectives to replace outdated and limiting ones, right? We're coming to try to find something new, fresh tools, because we are so weary, restless, and dissatisfied with our lives. And I wonder if there's some wisdom for us on the subject of boredom. So remember our affirmation. Boredom is when my highest self is nudging me towards greater fulfillment of the purpose of my life. So spirituality helps us clarify the purpose of our living and helps us learn to listen to that nudge. Spirituality invites us into mindfulness, doesn't it? It encourages us to know what we are thinking and to work to shift our thinking into directions that have us moving towards what? Greater freedom and love and abundance and fulfillment and joy. And those words are the purpose of your life. Our purpose is to be our highest self, expressing those words in what we're doing. But because we've developed the habit and we're so fast to reach for anything that relieves our boredom, it's challenging to get access to our thoughts long enough to know what we are thinking. So let me pause and share my own parenting experience with Kelsey and boredom. So I only had one child, and believe me, I also wanted to make sure that she was not dependent upon me for her entertainment either. You know, I remember a couple of times when she whined about being bored, man, I got her emptying the dishwasher and folding clothes and things because I'm like, I am not your entertainment. I was pushing her to have a relationship with her own mind through her own exploration of the world and not expect me to do that for her. I wanted to foster her growing her imagination. And it's not that I kept her away from computer screens. My mom and I were chuckling. There was this picture of her when she was 2, and the screen was up there, and she had her hand down here. And Mom says she was telling her to use the mouse, Gamma, use the mouse. She was 2, right? So she had this sense of screens around her, but it was not central to her free time experience. Because of her special needs, she had access to this lending library of toys. And so I wanted her to check out toys that were all about imagination and bringing situations for her to practice life. And very, 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 very young, she fell in love with books. She's a librarian now, so she must have fallen in love really hard with books, right? But her other mom and I agreed that she could not have any screen time during the week, and we limited screen time on the weekends. So portable screens were kind of becoming a thing about the time she was getting old enough to really relate to them, but we limited them to long car rides and airplanes, places where she couldn't relieve her boredom in many other ways without being really irritating to other people, right? So then we would give her that, but we wanted her to stay in touch with her own creativity. I don't remember when she got a phone, but it was probably around high school or so, and it was probably a flip phone with no apps or anything. But Sue Ann and I were just really aware of the value of internal time, and that it wasn't artificially filled by external stimulation. She was going to have a better relationship with her mind in a more powerful way. But now that she's an adult, however, I do worry about her addiction to her phone, and I wish that she would wake up and, her own aversion of boredom and what that might mean for her. But I have to let her learn her lesson her own way, right? That's her on her own time. Not easy, trust me. So boredom is actually a good thing, but what can you gain from boredom? What are its gifts? So how you fill your free time and your boredom reveals your ability to care for and love yourself, your body, your mind, your heart, and your spirit. And here are the gifts that I think allowing boredom offers as I see it. First, boredom could be revealing your inner longing for learning and growth. So when we find ourselves restless and dissatisfied, like the definition said, reach for active mind stimulation accompanied by sensory stimulation. This means you're going to start your further exploration of a topic on a screen, most likely, but accompany that by doing something related to what it is you're learning and growing your actual life experience of a new topic. It can also mean learning into practices like journaling and self-exploration, reading, taking a class, trying something new. If you have time to get bored, you have time to learn and grow. Second, boredom could be calling you to give yourself the space for imagination and creativity. As I said, for my grandmother, this meant sewing and quilting, and for my mother, it meant watercolors. But for me, it's writing and creating cookie pieces of art. That's my thing. But what is it for you? What's it for you? Find a creative outlet that allows your brain freedom. from passive stimulation, because creative activities give your mind that space to be in the flow, to do that thinking that my grandmother was doing. Creativity is one of the purposes of our lives. It's our inherent nature to be creative, to take elements and reorganize them to make something new, whether that's taking, physical string or wood or dirt or paint or whatever, but combining them to express yourself. If you have time to get bored, you have time to create. Third, boredom could be calling you to give yourself space for love and connection and oneness. So when you find yourself restless and dissatisfied, reach for love. Reach for love. One of the purposes of our soul is to connect with other souls. So lean into anything that gets you into connection or relationships. Go out and talk to someone in the world, even if it's just giving a compliment to a neighbor you meet on a walk. Foster friendship. Touch another person. Help in some way. Mom and I just sorted through boxes and boxes of letters and cards that had been written in times of boredom, actually, because they often started with something like, just sitting here thinking of you, and ended with, well, I got to go help with the kids or whatever. It was like filling a space of downtime in that person's day. So if you're going to be on your phone, send someone a text to connect in person. Make a phone call instead of passively scrolling past posts from your friends. If you have time to get bored, you have time to be the love you long for. Fourth, boredom could be nudging you to give yourself the space for self-care. So when you find yourself weary and dissatisfied, reach for self-love. Like my mom said, let's go for a walk. But this could mean any activity that you know you need, the physical, mental, emotional, or spiritual nourishment to come to a better version of yourself. Maybe what you need most is sleep, or a hot shower, or a solid, nutritious meal, or a real conversation with a good friend, or time in nature, or silence. But I guarantee you that your soul is not craving a smartphone hour. I know it's not. Screen time is not self-care. It is distraction from self-care. It is not connection. It is a substitute for real connection because it is one way and it is superficial. It is not creativity because it is intangible and does not involve your whole self. It can be learning, but it often imitates learning because it is usually without follow-through or actual application of the concepts you are taking in. Don't get me wrong. I'm not an old lady. I am older today, but I'm not an old lady villainizing screens, but instead I'm inviting you to look at what you have been avoiding for the past 15 years since screens took over in so many ways to avoid boredom. So I want to tell you about a friend of mine, an old friend of mine, who got very, very bored. So her name was Martina. This is a real story. It's not a joke. I know sometimes I tell a joke. Martina was working in accounting at a bank. And day after day after day, she was so bored at her job. She had gotten into banking because her father was in that field of work. Speaking of fathers, and she just felt like she would follow in his footsteps. But one day, out of boredom, she decided to bring a cake for a coworker's birthday. And it was a good cake. And someone joked that since she enjoyed it so much and sharing it so much, that she should do that more often. So Martina took that challenge, and she started creating beautiful cakes for other coworkers, like birthdays and special occasions. And work became less boring because she was bringing a kind of a layer of fulfillment and joy to it. Baking a cake was creativity, but it was also fostering bigger connection with people. And over time, she started branching out from cakes, and she began making cookies and cupcakes and other things, baking things. And more people began to ask her, would you bake this for my mother? Would you bake this and bake this? And she began to be known as the person who baked things. And after a few years of this, Martina had the courage to enroll in culinary school and studied baking and pastry, and went on to have a career as a pastry chef in Atlanta. And her entire life changed because she did not numb her boredom. She listened to it and heeded its call. And she followed it, and it led her out of boredom and into freedom and joy in her life. And her soul was not fulfilled at her work, but she leaned into learning and personal growth. She leaned into imagination and creativity. She connected with the people around her in a loving and helpful way, and she allowed boredom to lead to love herself more too. So today's lesson is an invitation to develop a relationship with boredom and to listen what it's trying to say to you. And throughout this summer, be mindful of what you habitually do when you enter into boredom. Let's not numb ourselves with our screens or with anything else for that matter. When we do so, we are killing our boredom instead of listening to it. We are denying our soul an opportunity to explore and live on the human plane in interesting ways. And may you rise to the call whenever you hear yourself utter or think the words, "I'm so bored." Let's anchor this in with an affirmative prayer. Will you pray with me? Just take a deep breath. And think about that feeling of boredom and when it begins to creep over. And know with me that that is your highest self saying, "Feed me. Let me express. Let me connect with something real. Let me live." And so I know that Spirit meets us in this intention as we make a commitment to stepping into life in a bigger and better way. I'm so thankful for the opportunity to share life with so many interesting people. I am not bored. And so with that heart of gratitude, I let it go and let it be, and we affirm it together. And so it is.